Hello everybody, welcome to the Hay Festival, welcome to the Discovery Stage. My name is Glyn Morgan, I am the head of stewards here at the festival, as it happens, but I'm also a curator at the Science Museum, which I think is more relevant to me being in this chair at the moment. So the theme of this session is positive futures, and perhaps it's easier to imagine positive futures at Hay, where we're surrounded by crowds of curious, erudite people of all ages. But it is, I think, a bit of a challenge thinking about them generally. And so we're going to touch on what positive futures are, but we're also going to take a step back and talk about the journey, how we get there. What do we think about the future now? How do we even begin to imagine positive futures, let alone build them and live in them? So, we are beset by headlines and social media that want to take us in a different direction. How do we change that track? And my guests here, the speakers that I'll be sharing on this journey of discovery in the Discovery tent, are on my far right, Danny Dorling, and he is a professor of geography at the University of Oxford and appears regularly on TV and radio. He's written for The Guardian, New Statesman, and other papers, and he advises the government and the Office for National Statistics. And then to my immediate right is Rob Hopkins, who is a time traveller, and more on that to come, and co-founder of Transition Network and of Transition Town Totnes, bringing local people together to build better futures through localisation strategies. Please give them a very warm Hay Festival. Brilliant. Okay, so Danny, if I could start with you. Your book you have so many books, you're here promoting more than one as it is. But the one that we're focusing on is this one, The Next Crisis, what we think about the future. So could you tell us a little bit about where this book comes from, the kind of stats and data that you're drawing on for this, and what does it tell us about what people think about the future?
Well, in a way, it's a book from the future because it's not actually published until next month.
So, it is on sale in the bookshop.
It is on the very first copies, yeah. For the last few years, I've been writing about the UK, and it's been very, very depressing. And so I decided about 3 years ago, this was during the pandemic, to try to write an optimistic book. And I thought, if I look at the globe as a whole, the world as a whole, I knew there were lots of good statistics, because if you look at the UK, you're endlessly producing league tables going, oh look, we're at the bottom in Europe, right? So there are good stories out there. And I wanted to widen the things I looked at. I was trying to work out what to do. Now, crisis was a strange thing to fall upon. I came across crisis by finding a survey that Mori did every month for many years, now in 30 countries in the world, including India, including a few countries in Africa, including countries in South America, where they ask people what most concerns them about their countries. And they give them 18 options, they don't change much. And I was fascinated by what people actually said when they're given a very wide range of things to think about, and how it alters over time, and how it alters geographically. Now, the kind of people who fill in surveys tend to be middle-class people. This is the world's middle class telling you what they're concerned about. Luckily, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences did their own survey, very similar questions. So once you've got India, China, and another 28 countries, you've got most of the world. And it's possible to actually chart the concerns. And the main concerns are not what you might think they are. I don't know if you want, should I give them away now?
Yeah, no, let's get into what those concerns are.
Number one, by a long way, is, and this is across the world, in most countries, most of the time, the cost of living crisis coupled with inequality and poverty. And before the cost of living crisis rose up in the pandemic, it was inequality and poverty. So you put those two together, now 1 and 2, and that is it. It's literally, how am I going to get by? And this is the world's middle class world about that. People who are poor don't fill in surveys, and I'm worried about getting to tomorrow, the next day. The second one was unemployment, concern about unemployment. Who's going to need me? Will I be wanted? And if any of you work in British universities at the moment, you'll know this, because half our universities are in deficit, half of them have got voluntary or not so voluntary redundancy schemes going. Youngsters are concerned when they're leaving school, if they're at university, who's going to want them in 5 or 10 years' time? And that shocked me, and I realised how privileged I was. I was shocked that unemployment was the number 2 issue. Number 3 is fear of crime, fear of violence, fear of burglary, fear of robbery, and fear of war and terrorism. Number 4 is worrying about care services, care, health, education, but services in general. In China, that's number 1, which partly tells you how well China's doing. That the biggest concern is health services, ageing population, some corruption in the health service, helps to bribe people. And then you get climate change, and that's the shock. And climate change has gradually and slowly been falling as a concern of the world's middle class. And then, partly because of how I arrange things, because I work in the School of Geography and Environment, and I wanted my colleagues to still talk to me, I bunched things together so that the environment, species, and so on actually came as the last one. But I had to put a lot of effort to even get that as a concern. And in a way, you could say that's the biggest thing. The species that are extinct, we can never bring them back. You know, climate change can end, as we're going to find out. But the most distant thing in time and the distant thing in space, even if it's the biggest thing, ultimately, is not the biggest concern. The biggest concern is literally, how am I going to have enough to get through next month and next year?
Which, you know, I mean, goes back to very simple GCSE biology lessons, where I was learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, all organisms require their immediate safety, their immediate food supply, their immediate heat, before they can start thinking about further things. And your data shows that's true on a societal level.
But also, we do care about each other enough that even if we are getting by, we've become more aware, globally in these surveys, that other people are not, which will include people in our wider family. And we don't like living in unequal societies with large amounts of poverty. And, you know, that's an achievement of advocacy, because it's got to that point in the world. The cost of living crisis, prices going up by 30% over 2.5 years, just made it really, really obvious that this was a problem. But it was already topping the polls before that came.
Yeah. But as you point out in the book, if we were to address the issues that are most concerning to people, issues of inequality and the cost of living, the ways in which we could address those issues will have beneficial effects for climate change.
On climate change, and there are some things that are remarkably fortunate. Unfortunate for the world, but so as you go up the income scale, as you get up to people who have an income of $1 million a year, 10 million a year, their hobbies, the things they do with that extra money, are the most carbon polluting things you can imagine. You know, this is flying around the planet on small planes, owning multiple properties, getting large cruise liners. There aren't many ways of getting as much diesel up into the air than having a very large ship going around the Mediterranean, taking you around on holiday. So, in countries where the income distribution is more even, the overall pollution load is lower. Right? Now, it would be really bad news for equality if it was good to have a few really rich people, because that stopped the poor people polluting and the rich people were really good stewards of the countryside and so on. Turns out it's the opposite. The more unequal your society, the higher the overall pollution per head. So, and that's good news, that the solution to one problem is the solution to the other one. Otherwise, you end up in a situation of what do we care about most? Poverty or the planet? And that really isn't a problem you have.
And you've spent your career analysing data of this sort and talking about these sorts of issues. When you took your survey, you know, when you started doing a survey on that more global scale, Were there things that surprised you, that jumped out?
Oh, there was loads and loads. And the problem is you very quickly stop being surprised, when you discover something new. I didn't just take people's word for it on the surveys. I looked at the classic way we align harms is by people's health. How many people are harmed, how many people are killed. And poverty is the biggest killer in the world. And as you go down, in the immediate time frame, then the things that people rank lower actually are causing fewer deaths. One shock was finding we've had more and more adverse weather events. Our climate's become more chaotic, we have bigger floods, more frequent floods, more unpredictable floods, we have more heat waves and so on. But the number of people dying as a result of these events has fallen every decade since the 50s. And we've got better at recording the deaths. So in the 50s, I think it was about 70 people died of climate-related events for every million people alive. Currently, in this decade, it's 1 per year dies per million. Because when a large amount of Pakistan floods now, only 1,600 people die. In the 50s and 60s, when we got large floods, tens and hundreds of thousands of people might die. And that's interesting. It's an adaptation. It's not that the planet's becoming safer. It's that we've got phone networks. It's that we know what to do. We get people out of the immediate harm. But even the proportion of people affected has actually gone down in the last 20 years, which in a way shows an adaptability to cope with. There's a certain amount of inevitable getting worse, that even if we were the best humans on the planet, we're not going to turn the curve like that. But we are good at dealing at least with a somewhat predictable change of more adverse events. And that surprised me. All that the highest recorded number of deaths from heat waves are in Russia, Europe and North America. You might think why? Because we're not used to heat, and we've got lots and lots of really very, very old people. And heat waves are very, very bad news in the 90s. And it should be a wake-up call. We're endlessly saying that people who are most affected by climate change are in the poorest parts of the world. Actually, hey, I can't see you, so I'm not being rude. The lights are on, but it's you. You are most likely, hopefully me, but you never know, I'll stop smoking. You are most likely to get to those ages that when you are, if you're lucky, 95 and happy, and 1976, if you remember 1976? Right, 1976 comes back, but add a couple of degrees to it, that's going to be really, really bad news for you. So, we have a massive vested interest, personal, local, even with our climate and the Gulf Stream and the fact that us and Korea, where the models are least affected, doesn't matter. Lots and lots of people at very old ages, you really don't want heat waves. So, and that's kind of good news because we have more power than most people in the world to do something about this. And more of those carbon atoms in the atmosphere are British than any other nationality. Yeah.
We've spent all this time worrying about what flag the fish are flying, and it's carbon atoms we should be focusing on. Okay, you mentioned turning the curve. Crisis, the word crisis, we associate it with a disaster, a moment of something imminently about to go wrong, but actually the original meaning of the word is a turning point or a moment for a decision to be made. So, Rob, if I can turn to you now, how do we begin to turn that curve and begin the process of moving towards futures where, all of these issues are perhaps less, things that we are less needing to worry about?
Well, I think, good afternoon everyone. I think for me one of the things is that we have to help people, we have to talk about the future in a way that we cultivate longing for it. I'm a great believer in this idea of longing. And so during COVID, the last book I wrote was all about imagination and the fact that at a time when climate change demands that we fundamentally reimagine everything, our collective imagination, which should be a muscle like this, has sort of become a muscle like this at the worst possible time because we don't prioritise it in our education system, we don't prioritise it in society. We know that the more unequal a society becomes, the more difficult it becomes for people to be imaginative. And so during COVID, I started, like lots of people, I started doing a podcast. It was called From What If to What Next. And I set myself a rule at the beginning to never do any episodes with 3 white male guests, which we've slightly failed at today. But as a way of doing a podcast, it was fantastic, and it opened a whole lot of conversations and connections that were just wonderful. And one of those was that there's a whole like the world that I was in of climate activism was very much people talking about collapse and extinction. That was the narrative. Collapse, extinction. I go to France, they've got this collapsology movement with people saying, well, collapse is now completely inevitable. Actually, I found there was this whole people like Adrienne Marie Brown, Ruha Benjamin, Marianne Kaba, really fascinating women mostly in the US, mostly black women, also indigenous futurists, queer futurists who were writing about futures in a way that were really, really fascinating and thrilling. And then the thing that tipped me was I saw this T-shirt a young woman was wearing at a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington in 2020, and it said, "I've been to the future, we won." Exactly, that's what I was like, yeah! It gave me goosebumps, maybe it's giving you goosebumps now. And I saw it about 3 weeks before I'd been invited up to London for Extinction Rebellion's, the big one, where it was surrounding Parliament, demanding to keep climate on the agenda and stuff. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try something for this. So I went to my local hardware shop and I bought this sort of hazmat suit thing. And I bought a child's sort of space helmet thing like this. And I went and I gave this talk as if we've built a time machine. I've just come back from 2030, the 2030 that resulted from us doing everything we could have possibly done. And it was a bit scary. I thought, am I going to look like a complete idiot? And actually everyone's going to think, what is this guy talking about? And I did this talk for about 10 minutes, and the bicycle rush hours of 2030, oh my God, they were amazing. And we saw this, and we saw that, and you know, people told me they still have hangovers from the party that celebrated the end of BP in 2028, and all this. And there was a moment in the middle of it where I said something like, you know, just standing here, having been there, just standing here, telling you about it, makes me feel really emotional. You know, I've been there, it's incredible, we did it. And I looked around and there were tears on people's faces. I thought, I've never done that before, not that I'm aware of anyway, I've never elicited that response before. And then a few days later I got asked to go and give a talk for to do the same thing for an organisation called the British Association for Sustainability in Sport. And I did the same thing, and then the first question this woman said, she said, "Rob, when you were in 2030, were there lots of repair cafes?" And I said, well, I just want to say, first of all, I love that you've suspended disbelief to the extent that it's like, Rob, I hear you were in Paris, can you recommend any good cafes? You know, there's something that happens, I think. And so one of the interviews that I did in the new book was with Peter Kalmus. Some of you may know, amazing climate scientist in the US. He's one of the climate scientists who has really pioneered that move away from just publishing science to actually saying, no, this is not enough anymore. He's been arrested twice for gluing himself to the Chase Bank building, for blocking a private, private jet airport. And so I had a long conversation with him, and he said, I said, so, you know, all the time as a climate scientist, you're talking about the worst case scenarios, the lines at the top of the graph that do that. I said, what is the best case scenario? And so he said, well, the best case scenario is we go into what I call emergency mode. Emergency mode is the line that kind of does that. It's the line where we have a rapid phase out of fossil fuels, a rapid phasing out of the industrial meat system, and then we have a chance that we stay below 2 degrees, and then we bring in all the natural stuff, the drawdown stuff, the seaweed, the forest, the soils, all that stuff. I said, that's brilliant, Peter, but emergency mode is a crap name for it. Can't we call it something else? Can't we call it something that evokes a sort of a sense of longing and desire for it? The way I always talk about it is the moon landings, right? So in 1865, Jules Verne wrote a book called From the Earth to the Moon. Really thrilling, exciting book about how we might get to the moon, pulled together all the best science he could find. And that book then inspired a whole generation of scientists and engineers, but also storytellers, The first film that was made in 1902, Georges Méliès, A Trip to the Moon. You have this whole genre of popular science. Some of you here will have grown up with those comics about how we get to the moon. What do we do there? What will we eat on the moon? There were jazz dances about walking on the moon. Mickey Mouse went to the moon. Popeye went to the moon. Tintin went to the moon. In the 50s, there was this whole amazing genre of really awful films that were about all-male crews of astronauts landing on the moon to find it populated entirely by women who hadn't seen men for ages and ages. And there was one called Cat Women of the Moon that says, see the lost city of love-starved cat women. And it's one of the worst things. I watched it so you didn't have to. I took one for the team. But it's spectacularly bad. But it meant that in 1963, when JFK announced we would go to the moon, we did it in 6 years. The average age of the team that did it was 28. And when Neil Armstrong did land on the moon, Hergé, who did all the Tintin books about going to the moon, did a cartoon of Neil Armstrong landing on the moon and being greeted by Tintin and Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus with a sign saying, "Welcome to the moon, Mr. Armstrong." Because the longing comes first. If we just talk about... We wouldn't have got to the moon if we just sat around just talking about rocket collapses and things going wrong. So we don't. But the thing is, now we don't have 100 years. But we're sitting in a world where every time we turn on the TV or every time we open books, we get dystopian story after dystopian story, or utopian stories, which are almost as useless because they're so far out. And so for me, it's like, what are the stories now of how we start? How do we talk about the future? And the beautiful thing about it is that the kind of future that Danny is talking about, which is where tackling the climate emergency with the speed that is required, and fixing society and putting it back together again and ending the inequality that we see that is at the top of those lists is the way we do it. Most of the solution in the book, I pulled together a whole load of different solutions that are win-win, win-win, win-win-win-win scenarios. And there are so many of those. And so for me, it's like we need to... But most people don't know those stories. And we need to tell those to bring that alive for people, I think.
Exactly, because people say that emergency mode, to use the bad name, that you describe, the classic rejoinder to that will be, oh, well, yes, but, of course that'd be nice, but it is hopelessly naive. It's not possible. Can't be done. What are you talking about? But in the book, you combat that. You have a chapter called Adjust Your Disbelief Suspenders, where you take all of these scenarios, these things that might not be possible, that people say might not be possible, such as truly local food systems and car-free urban districts and commercial restaurants that cook just with the heat from the sun. And you've got case after case after case of these things, and they're all real projects that already exist.
Yeah. William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. Yeah. And I have this very kind of privileged role in the transition movement, which is that I get to go around Europe. I don't fly, so I just within train radius from the UK, and I get to go and visit places where this is already happening. And there's so many. There's a one of my favourites is this town in the south of France called Mouansartou, which is quite hard for an English person to say. Whenever I say Mouansartou, everyone giggles. But it's this place where the municipality there have spent the last 6-7 years building a new food system, where the municipality compulsorily purchased land that was going to be used to build executive housing. And then they created a market garden there. And now in Mouansartou, 100% of the school meals in all the schools in the town are organic. 80% of them are grown in the town. It's also the first town I've ever been to with a goth mayor. The most fantastic hair. And anyway, I digress. And so they produce the school meals there. But the most fascinating thing about it is the knock-on impacts it had in the town. When you see an organisation, a municipality like that, move with purpose and agency and determination to make change happen, now in Mouansartou, 30% of people eat less ultra-processed food than they did before that started. People eat 27% eat meat, they eat more food, more organic food, more local food. That model has then spread to many, many other places. But the thing is that because the way they prepare that food generates 75% less food waste, and they use 50% less meat in the school meals. They do it for the same price as all the other schools, €2.20, what the French government gives for school meals. They do it within that budget. So if they can do it, everybody can do it. and all the other kind of indicators start to go up. The other one I always love talking about is that in the Netherlands, I went to Utrecht to go and see the bicycle rush hour. 40,000 bicycles cycle into the centre of Utrecht every morning. If you want to get a sense of what a low-carbon future would be like, just go and sit by the train station in Utrecht, 8 o'clock in the morning. It's mind-blowing. But the reason that happens is because the Dutch government every year invests €500 million in building really, really good cycling infrastructure, not the rubbish we see quite a few places here. It's like all these underground car parks, they don't use them for cars anymore, they fill them with bikes. It's free. You leave your bike there, there's people who'll fix your bike during the day while you're at work. It's just this whole amazing infrastructure. But they reckon that for every €1 million they spend building that cycling infrastructure, it saves them 38 million off the national health bill. So it's not an expense, it's not a cost, it's an investment. We can take that same way of thinking, apply it to how we feed our kids, to how we build houses, all that stuff. At the moment, we don't think in systems. We break everything down into little pieces. If we think joined up, it's absolutely possible that we could create the most extraordinary futures that actually address all of the things that Danny's talking about.
I realised I didn't mention the name of your book, Rob. So your book is How to Fall in Love with the Future, a Time Traveller's Guide to Changing the World, which this
also
is
not out till next
also not out. So this really is a event from the future. So Danny, coming back to you, given that so many of these projects already exist, why are we not hearing about them? Why is it that these negative stories, the things that are driving the worries or trying to drive our worries, are more dominant? Do you think?
We're good at worrying. We're a species that's fairly good at worrying. Our eyes are set back for the thing that's going to come and eat us from behind. If you ever brought up children, you spend your time constantly worrying about what's going to happen, because we don't have that many children. So we are worriers, just in general. And this is protective, but it gets a bit it gets you down if you spend your time thinking about it all the time. There are also vested interests who don't want this kind of thing happening, because you're not going to make a lot of money out of it. Right? The people who are doing well in the Netherlands, because of the system, are those people who are fixing bikes during the day, but they're not paid a lot. Right? It is the air being cleaner in the Netherlands, but it is not a few men becoming very rich because of this. So there are people who don't want these things to happen, because they won't be able to get rich in a short amount of their lifetime. And we do have to realise that if it wasn't for them, this would all be happening far faster. That they want you to think it's impossible, that the car has to be dominant, that this is just ridiculous. They can do it in the Netherlands because it's flat. Right? A lot of places are very flat. And we do have electric bikes now. So, suddenly it is possible to bike from the bottom of a very steep hill to the top hill at the age of 74 and not be that fit. I've forgotten the proportion of pensioners in the Netherlands who cycle. 20 years ago it was a quarter, and I think we have 1%. And it's good for you cycling, as long as you make the traffic system safe enough so that you are safe on a bike. Those vested interests do matter. The people who do believe in inequality, the people who never mention climate change, because it's all about global war. Have we got enough troops? Have we got enough armies? How can we beat the Chinese and the Russians? Or at the extreme, how can we get to Mars and fill it with white people? And those are the kind of fantasies that a few rich men have, and this is a problem, because they control newspapers, they fund political parties, and they think that people like us are complete and utter fantasies, who at one extreme are dangerous, because we will reduce the productivity of a country, and the productivity going for growth is part of our macho position in the world. And we can do a little bit for the climate, but really what matters most is something else, and then draping yourself with lots of flags behind you. And if it wasn't for that, it would be easier. And the countries which go in for less patriotism do better. There are international indices on this. Who invests most on biodiversity? Which places have gone green the most? Who isn't? I think one of my students recently found that we have more private planes being flown from largely private airports, a huge number around London, more private planes than in the whole of China. Right? And it's not because China's poor, they just have a different transport system and recognise the stupidity of having private planes when you can just whisk a train from here to there relatively easily. But it's a different mindset. The United States, the most extreme I ever saw in the States was a mayor in Texas arguing against the building of pavements. Because you shouldn't have pavements because people might walk. Because, and the quote was, pavements are the beginning of the road to communism. Now, yeah, it's laughable, but, and we should be optimistic because the arguments that these people have for individual competition, the market rules first, don't worry about what's happening collectively, it'll all sort out somehow. These are relatively facile arguments that should be defeated. But then there's the other side, which is you can look at the projections, and it is not hard to look at the degree to which we have wars, the degree to which, you know, we're now susceptible to diseases, the degree to which the predictability of the planet heating up is just there with an error band where the scary stuff is what if we're wrong and it's bigger. And you can just say, well, something's almost certainly going to go wrong. But it isn't a particularly helpful way of thinking. We are a very young species. Things have gone wrong. But so far we've been very, very adaptable to them and worked out ways and solved all our biggest problems. It's only just over a century ago that one of the biggest problems in London was how are we going to deal with the depth of the manure from the horses. You know, people couldn't imagine that there could be a way that London could function without it sinking under the weight of horse shit. Right? And that was all.
Now we have metaphorical bullshit.
Shortly after then.
Now we have Facebook.
Yeah, the great fear that the working class, the residuum, were going to overbreed and we'd all become a planet of stupid people because us clever middle class people were not having enough clever middle class children. Right? Eugenics was the major fear of the time a century ago, on left and right. Right? We often have huge fears which actually turn out not to come true, and sometimes, in the case of eugenics, were completely and utterly wrong.
I didn't think I was going to go this way, but I'm going to pick up on eugenics because in the history of utopian visions of the future, you know, pre-World War II, there is a strong vein of leftist writers, you know, H.G. Wells, people like that, who are pro-eugenics, saying, you know, we've got to sterilise the criminal classes, and only then can we move forward into a utopian future.
Yeah, and that's taking one new theory, massive theory, which is completely correct, which is evolution, and jumping from that to something which was wrong, but led to that when the dons of my university, the lecturers of the University of Oxford, sent their children to America just before the Second World War to preserve the genes, you know, which is ridiculous if you saw them.
My question was going to be, so, you know, like, obviously now we recognise that those are problematic to say the least, visions of the future. How do we avoid falling into similarly dangerous traps while trying to imagine better futures now? Well, I don't know, not necessarily eugenics, but what are the futures that we're in?
Simple, often just simple checks. You know, when people say we're getting more diseases, just count up the pandemics, you know, and the epidemics. They are remarkably getting less and less frequent. We've just lived through a large one. The last large one of the AIDS was probably the 1968 flu that hardly any of you can remember, but you know, you would have been knocked out for a week in 1968. There was a time when diphtheria, cholera, they were coming all the time.
Annual.
Yeah. Now, you can't be quite sure how on earth we've got to a point when COVID-19 was such a shock because we hadn't had something like that for such a long time before. But it's good news. So simple checks, when somebody says something like, it's the poor who are most affected by climate change, find some numbers. You know, it may be that they will be, but at the moment it is very hard to actually find, we're going to be flooded by climate migrants. That used to be very popular in IPCC reports. It's now kind of almost disappeared from them. Not a useful scare story, not true. People migrate for many, many reasons. War's a big one. You could try to make an argument that our wars are caused by climate change, and some people have. But you draw out a map of all the wars in the world since 1989, and essentially it's Muslim countries being the victims of Western powers fighting wars over them. And it's not because of where they are in the world, it's because of the colour of the skin of the people means that they are allowable to die. And the weapons are made by Christian countries. Yeah. It's simple fact checks on statements that are made at least ground you a little bit into reality. There's always a fear that there'll be something we believe, just as all those clever people in the 30s believed in eugenics on left and right. That could, so you've got to have the scepticism. That the basis of science is always thinking that you're going to be wrong. Yeah. Like never being completely sure and looking for the thing that tells you that you're wrong. It's a bit depressing doing it, because you might have a brilliant theory, and the way you deal with your brilliant theory is endlessly trying to find the example that proves that it's wrong, because you don't want to put out an idea there that is dangerous because it is wrong.
I think the way I would come to that was, there's a film that was made a few years ago called 2040 by an Australian director called Damon Gappo, which was it was quite a brave attempt to make a film using CGI and different things about what would a fairer, low-carbon future look like. And he described the film as an experiment in evidence-based dreaming. That's sort of the way I try and come up with stuff. Is it's like, well, what can we? It's like if I had a dream that I was going to become rich, it would need to be at least rooted in me buying a lottery ticket or marrying a millionaire or something like that. Not just that the dragon is going to fly past my house and shower gold coins on the front garden. Yeah. So actually, all of what I try and do is to point to the fact that you can find all of this stuff. It's not happening somewhere. And I love that question about naive. I've had that thrown at me ever since I started doing this stuff. And I always say, in 2008, the transition movement was kick-started, which started in my town in South Devon and is now in about 50 different countries around the world, community-led responses to the climate emergency, and what's the bit that we can do as people organising in our communities. And in that book, it said we need to urgently break our dependency on fossil fuels, and we need to build more resilience in terms of food and energy, and that needs to be the priority. People said, Rob, that's terribly naive. And actually what we did instead was we spent that time sending Russia 18 billion euros every month for natural gas. And all during that time, we were told, there's no money for decarbonising, there's no money for insulating everyone's houses, there's no money for building cycling infrastructure, there's no money for all that stuff. And now, as a result of having sent 18 billion euros a month, the European Union is saying we need to raise 800 billion euros in order to rearm against Russia. It's like, so who's the naive one now here? Sorry. Actually, of course, there's a chapter in the book where I say we need to move away, stop using the word impossible and replace it with the word not yet. Because all the stuff that we get told is impossible is often actually the things that we need to do, and vice versa. And one of the people who I talk about in the book a bit is Sun Ra, the amazing jazz musician and Afrofuturist. And he had this most beautiful, he told a story about himself where he said, I'm not actually a human being, I'm actually an angel from Saturn. And with his band, we travelled through space. Yeah. And it was a different way of, yes, exactly, and it was a different way of talking about black liberation, and it was very powerful and beautiful. And I love it, there's a quote by him where he said, the future is obvious, but the potential impossible is calling softly and knocking gently. I love that. It's like we get so often told the future is a thing. The future is this lump that sort of sits in front of us. But actually, as I always, when I do my time travelling work with people, I would say there are many different quantum threads from the future, from the present into the future. And many of them are horrible. Believe me, I've followed these threads and been there to see them, and they're awful. But there are some that exist on the outer edges of possibility. And so what I try and do in the work I do with workshops and kind of public events and shows and stuff is to try and give people a kind of a multi-sensory experience. What would that future smell like? What would it sound like? What would it sound like to move? Like, we know from the Paris Agreement by 2030 we need to cut our emissions by 48%. That's 5 years off. And some people say, well, that's impossible. Well, if we miss that, we miss the 2050 targets, everything else gets pushed out. So let's say we have to do that, and we're going to do that. What would it be like to wake up in the 2030 where we were more than halfway there? And we could see people's lives improving. We could see the mental health of young people improving. We could smell the difference in the air. The world around us sounded differently. Well, if in 2025 we could create these kind of tears in the fabric of time and kind of reach through and give people a taste of that so they can see what it would smell like, feel like, taste like. For me, that feels like a really, really profoundly important thing that we need to be doing.
So for people who want to start going on that journey, who want to pull those tears into the fabric of time, where would you suggest they start looking for that inspiration to begin their own imaginative, to build their time machines?
The beautiful thing about time travel, so before H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine, the idea had never occurred to anybody that you could have a device and you could choose to go to different places in time. Never occurred to Shakespeare, Jules Verne, any of those people. The idea never occurred. As soon as H.G. Wells wrote the book, everyone went, oh yeah, cool, where are we going? And there's a book by James Gleick called Time Travel, where he says that time travel is like the pixie dust that you sprinkle. So like, when I do a workshop, if I said, this pair of glasses is actually a time machine, carefully calibrated by our team in our secret laboratory in Totnes, and actually when I raise this arm, it actually turns this room into a time portal and we can travel. No one's there going, what are you talking about? People go, oh, where are we going? So there's something really, really kind of accessible about it. And so I'm doing this project called Field Recordings from the Future, where I've been to places around Europe that sound like that future would sound like, because it's already there. I've been and recorded the bicycle rush hour in Utrecht, car-free neighbourhoods in Germany, regenerative farms, landscapes being rewilded by beavers, and then we've created an album of that music and a live show where people come in and we project videos all around them. We're doing a comic book which is about how we build a time machine and travel to 2030, because you mentioned Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. One of the reasons they're so nuts and all this nonsense about we're going to go to Mars, why would you want to live somewhere with no trees? I just don't get it at all. It's because of the comic books they read when they were kids.
Yeah.
What we need now is the comic books full of beaver rewilding and underground mushroom farms and bicycles, and so that stuff becomes the new normal, and we just talk about it in that sense. So my sense is that actually building a time machine is really is kind of the easy bit. The thing is just facilitating and holding the space where you can sprinkle that pixie dust, and actually people generally don't go, oh, come on.
Yeah, and you can, to give it away, the next crisis ends at the very end by going back in time to 1914 to a group who had a utopian vision, a strange, slightly subversive group called the Socialist Sunday School Movement, which still exists, I hear, in Glasgow. I thought it had gone. Yeah, this is somebody's that one. And the Socialist Sunday School Movement had 10 commandments, 10 things you should do. They were on a high in 1914, very sadly, just before the world went to war, or part of the world. But their 10 commandments have largely been achieved. They were seen as utterly utopian. You read them now, they are sensible. The funniest thing, or a bit depressing, I give talks in schools, and sometimes my slides are vetted to check on Prevent that I'm not a terrorist, or to be, I'm not. And one school did say to me, we're not sure you can show these 10 commandments to our children. And I go, these were produced in 1914, I'm not trying to be evangelical about it, I'm just, it's an example that people in the past dreamed things, and they were achieved, right? And all the good things that we currently have were a dream. You can take everything that we've achieved, a health centre, and you can go back and find the original pamphlet that said Why don't we put some of our doctors together so they can support each other and have some nurses and health visitors so we don't have a lone doctor on a horse anymore? Right? Everything, every good thing that we currently have was originally dreamed up by a utopian, and that's why we have what we have today. And you can look back in the past and it's easy. It's not as fun. Going forward into the future really, really is fun. But it just makes it much more realistic to say, and this is how we get it, because it's how we've always got the world improving, by dreaming what was thought to be impossible.
And I think it's particularly important now because we're in a time where the far right are kind of cancelling the future or colonising the future. And there was a lovely thing that I read the other day. Naomi Klein wrote a brilliant article with Astra Taylor. She said, contemporary far-right movements lack any credible vision for a hopeful future. The average voter is offered only remixes of a bygone past, alongside the sadistic pleasures of dominance over an ever-expanding assemblage of dehumanised others. And I think that thing of like actually holding the spaces where people are given the permission and the freedom and the safe places where we can actually allow ourselves to imagine beyond what's in front of us, to connect to the impossible, to hear those stories of what's possible, feels to me like one of the most radical things that we can be doing right now. We can't let the future be cancelled. We can't let the future be colonised. We have to fill it with things to run towards rather than things to run screaming in the opposite direction from.
Yeah. I mean, Bell Hooks, who you quote in your book, said that what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And I think that is the power of what we're talking about, that we need to have that imaginative capacity before we can build this better future. Just to return to Bezos and Musk briefly, I just want to say, they seem to have fundamentally misunderstood most of the science fiction that they seem to be fans. Like Ian M. Banks would hate Elon Musk, and yet he says he's like one of his great inspirations and things. So it just shows the importance of good English teachers as well in helping them actually understand the stuff that they're reading. We have just over 10 minutes remaining, and I do want to get out into the audience and get some questions. So hopefully there are some stewards, my stewards, with their paddles and their mics. So get your hands up if you've got a question. There's one right in the middle here, so someone could get a mic there. And is there another one that we can set up ready? Right, let's go in the...
It's all happening in the middle.
Yeah, it's all happening in the middle. Oh, okay. Which mics can you get there first?
That's exciting.
It's a race. I think we're going with number 2 first, please. Number 2.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, albeit a little bit doomy from my perspective. And before I go out and self-flagellate even more, can I ask your time machine to predict what will happen tomorrow if Britain would evaporate and produce no more pollution? How much would the world temperature reduce? And as a follow-up question, Britain has deindustrialised as an example to the rest of the world how to reduce carbon. What other countries have followed us in that endeavour? And I'm just anticipating you thinking if we lead, people will follow. Thank you.
Correct. Shall we go first?
I'll do a little bit. If we went and evaporated tomorrow, us evaporating would be a greater contribution than the average set of people in the world of our size. So we still overpollute compared to the average. But I'll let you do the second part.
But also, I would kind of reframe that question and say, what if the UK really led by example in a way that was profoundly inspiring to the rest of the world? Why do we have to take this sort of, well, it feels like all the different sort of organisations and bodies and countries in the world who should be leading this in a kind of a race are also looking at each other and using each other's inaction to justify their own inaction. We don't do the same, like, I don't know, the Eurovision Song Contest. We don't also look at each other and go, well, it doesn't matter what's the point of them? Actually, we could be setting a new story that could inspire other places around the world. And it's particularly important now where we have the Trump administration who are scaling back undermining, defunding, scrapping, banning the use of the word climate change, imagining that somehow if you just don't mention it, it'll somehow disappear. It's a really dangerous time. Climate scientists being sacked left, right and centre in the US. So the UK has a kind of, we started this, after all. We started the industrial... It's not a self-flagellation thing. It's just saying, actually, wouldn't it be amazing if we started the industrial revolution? Wouldn't it be amazing if we started the decarbonising revolution?
Or there's another way to put it, it's like negative. Well, I'm not sure about using Eurovision achievements.
Maybe.
What we're currently good at isn't necessarily something to be proud at. So we lead the world in a casino banking system outside of European rules, but it's a dangerous banking system. We're world number one for the gambling industry in the world, because we've reduced the taxes so that more of the world's gambling goes through our computers than the US computers. There's nothing to be proud of. Or overseas students who are great, but they fly, and we can't carry on forever attracting the children of the world's upper class coming here like some Swiss finishing school. So if you look at what our growth industries currently are, they're not something we should necessarily be proud of. Yeah. Whereas we could do this, having the English language is an advantage, and very clever people will come to this country for some bizarre reason, because of the history, because of the language, because of the excitement of London. And they get a bit of a shock when they arrive here because the living standards are so low compared to where they come from. But they will help us do it, and we can pull together people to do things and be proud of it.
And also the deindustrialisation has happened largely just because we've offshored it to other places. It's like, our carbon footprint has gone down, but if you bring back in the manufacturing of all the stuff we used to make and we've offshored, they haven't actually dropped very much at all. So my sense is that we could be modelling and showing a new story for a fairer, cleaner world where we have much less gap between the richest and the poorest, and we have a flourishing society, and we're decarbonising, and people live in warmer, dry, clean homes. It's like all of that.
And we have some exciting things that other places don't have. So we have tidal ranges in our estuaries that other places don't have. But there's enough of them exist around the world that if we were to get our act together and do something with that tidal energy, it's exportable. But it's there on a plate for us to do something with. It does require planning and large projects of a kind that we haven't done, since we built the Humber Bridge. And we've got really bad at it. You think about HS2, that's largely a story of corruption, which we don't call corruption. The money went somewhere, right? And we've got to get ourselves out of doing things really, really badly into doing something you can actually be proud of, that's a bit bigger and lasts longer than the Olympics.
Number one.
Thank you very much indeed. Big problem. Who does the remodelling? We have spineless governments, we have corrupt corporations. They are going to be the barrier to it. You talked about local initiatives, topness, things like that. I see very little evidence of that happening across our country. I've been to Utrecht as a pedestrian. It's the most dangerous place I've ever been to. Who does it? There's too much in the way. We will do all this as we collapse at the last minute when we're forced to, as with COVID.
Where are you? I couldn't...
right up there in the middle.
Oh, because they were all looking over there, and you were all looking over there. Okay.
It can feel dangerous in those cycling cities. Copenhagen may be the one. You do have to look. You do have to be careful. You have to realise they are going relatively fast on a track made just for bikes. But it may feel dangerous. But we have numbers. Believe me, a car, a ton of steel, going at 30 miles an hour, which is why it's 20 now in Wales. A car going at 30 is fatal to a small child or an old pensioner. A bike will hurt a lot. But we're talking a small... Anyway, on that. We do look a bit like the last place in Europe that may do this, right? Which is part of the challenge. Because you can look at other European countries, you can look at ones that have set targets for 2030 and they're still trying to reach them. You can look at Freiburg. There are many, many cities across Europe which are greener. They've got air transport down, they've got a decent rail system. They do those tickets where you pay only €40 a month and you can travel. People who work in business don't fly, and that's normal in much of the continent. So we are starting very, very much behind. So what do? Just give up? You say already we are a peripheral European country. The poorest fifth of people here are poorer than the average poorest fifth in Eastern Europe. Or you say, given we now recognise that what we were doing has failed so utterly, we are going to need a different plan. And it's a national plan. I would give it other names than Green New Deal. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily go for patriotism, and I would try and make it optimistic. But we've tried. We've tried to ape America. We've tried let business do what it wants and deregulate. We've tried cut our taxes to the lowest level in Europe and see whether that makes us richer. We've tried all these things, and the result has been awful. So we're going to have to do something different, and this does seem like a no-brainer to do something good that is different, and we have enough time to do it. We're packed with universities, right, which are in financial trouble at the moment. But these things can be sorted out if you have the vision to do it. And I'd agree, our politicians at the moment do not all of them, but they need something. They need something to offer people which gives relatively short-term rewards. One example, the government currently has a target, I think, of around about 300,000 houses a year to build. If they actually could build that, which they can't, we'd fail on our agreements on the Paris Accord for just how much pollution we would cause from the concrete. So we can't sort out the housing anyway, because we can't get enough builders or afford to do it. But, and this again, to stereotype you, most areas of Britain, at least 30% of houses have 2 spare bedrooms. We most inefficiently lose our housing stock at the moment. There's a lot of things that can be done relatively quickly, getting people out of large family houses where they're living on their own, by making it possible to move to somewhere without stairs, because your hips go. These things are all green to do. But it's a positive future. It just has to be painted in the way you're much better at doing than I am. of saying, and the alternative to this is what? Slowly going down the track, counting at what point are we? There are only 5 countries in Europe where babies die more often in their first 4 weeks of life than us. We've dropped that low that we have a neonatal mortality rate where we are currently competing with Romania. Right? What do you want to do? Just go down and see at what point we can get to the bottom of these things?
When I went to Utrecht, I met the woman who was the head of transport management for the city, and she said, all the problems we had with cars 10 years ago, we now have with bicycles. Because there's so many of them. I said, but that's kind of a problem a lot of cities would love to have. I was in Copenhagen last week, cycled around Copenhagen, it's just amazing. But for me, to answer your question, for me, I think where this comes from, the places where the most exciting things that I see coming from is from communities and local government and business find new creative ways of working together. And one of the best ones of those is from the city of Liège in Belgium, which is a story that I have in the book as well, where in 2014 the community came together with a question, what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? They call it the Liège food belt. And in 2018 I went back to Liège. They had raised, the community organisations had raised €5 million of investment, not from the banks, not from the municipality, from the people in that city, investing into 30 new cooperatives in that city. They had shops in the centre. It was amazing. Then I went back in 2024. Now the municipality, who spent the first 3 years looking at it thinking these people are mad, have got involved. They've invested in food logistics hubs on the side of the city. They produce 3,500 school meals every day. Local produce, that money stays locally. Every time I go there, blows me away, because they just have this real sort of can-do attitude. That model has now spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. It's unlocked all kinds of land in different ways, training young people now to grow food as part of that system. It's all possible. It works. We can see it. We can see it happening.
You say, I'm afraid we don't have any time for any more questions. I'm getting the red flashing zeros. Rob, you say in my own work I try and create utopian moments that invite the past or the future into the present, to give people that experience of when I was in the future. We need to think differently about where we're going and what that means for us, and these 2 books are part of the roadmap for us to get there. These 2 amazing writers will be next door in the bookshop signing. Please thank them for their time, and please do